What is up, everybody? Welcome to yet another episode of Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld, and this is episode 6 of Hockey on the Spot, continuing with our 30 NHL teams in 30 days for the entire month of August. And for today's episode, we are going to be talking about the Los Angeles Kings. The LA Kings are now a little over a year removed from their Stanley Cup championship in 2012. It was the ultimate Cinderella run, historic Cinderella run for sure. They were the eighth seed in the Western Conference, and they knocked out the top three Western Conference teams that season. They knocked out all three division leaders: the President's Trophy winning Vancouver Canucks, the St. Louis Blues, and the Phoenix Coyotes, on en route to defeating the New Jersey Devils in the Stanley Cup Finals in 6 games. Going into this lockout shortened season, they had much higher expectations and the expectations of repeating their championship. Well, when the season starts out, they get off to a really rough start. In a start where they were barely winning games, and then all of a sudden they turn it on and they don't stop, and they work their way up to finishing fifth in the Western Conference, and they went to the Western Conference Finals for the second straight year. They once again defeated the St. Louis Blues this year for the second straight year, this time in the first round in 6 games after trailing the series 2-0. Then they defeat the rival San Jose Sharks in what was a back and forth series. They defeated them in 7 games, a series where the home team won every game. And then they had the unfortunate mispleasure of meeting the Chicago Blackhawks in the Western Conference Finals, a President's Trophy team for the ages, a team that barely lost any games, particularly in regulation. Had a historic 7-game comeback against the Detroit Red Wings. They ended up defeating the Los Angeles Kings in 5 games and ending their playoff run, their long playoff run. They went on to win the Stanley Cup. So for the Los Angeles Kings, they entered this offseason in bitter disappointment. And for this offseason, it's really been more about re-signing their guys. They really didn't go out and get too many new players. They did get a few new players, but not too many. um, they, they re-signed Kyle Clifford and Trevor Lewis, both valuable members from that 2012 team, signed them to 2-year deals. They were more recent. They re-signed defenseman Jake Muzzin to a 2-year deal. Midway through the Stanley Cup Finals, they re-signed Robin Regehr to a 2-year extension. I believe they also signed Keaton Ellerby, re-signed Keaton Ellerby to a 1-year deal. And then the two big re-signings for them that happened earlier in the offseason, they give defenseman Slava Voinov a 6-year contract. He has become one of their more valuable defensemen, and probably battles Drew Doughty for being the most valuable defenseman. And the big splash they made this year, they gave their captain Dustin Brown an 8-year extension. So he would have been an unrestricted free agent at the end of the season. So a very good re-signing or contract extension by the LA Kings, which tells us that he'll be their captain for many years to come, and that he could quite possibly end his career as a Los Angeles King. So it's been a big story. So that was one of the bigger stories when it happened. Former 2003 first round pick, 13th overall. So just a great re-signing by the Kings for sure. But they did make a few additions because they did have a few subtractions. So we'll start with the subtraction, starting with their biggest subtraction this offseason. Veteran defenseman Rob Scuderi, guy who's not getting any younger, but still a great shutdown defenseman. Huge loss on the LA Blue Line. He decides to return to his roots and go back to the Pittsburgh Penguins. He signs a 4-year deal there. Dustin Penner also leaves the Los Angeles Kings. That was a loss that was intended. He had another rough year in LA. He signs a 1-year deal, also going back to his roots with the Anaheim Ducks. Did not really have a good Los Angeles Kings career, with the exception of the 2012 playoffs. Let's see. They lose Brad Richardson. He signs with the Vancouver Canucks as he began to fade out as their fourth-line center when Colin Fraser started coming in more. Brad Richardson started fading out more, so his loss was seen coming from a mile away. And then, after many years of all the rumors of Jonathan Bernier being traded, guess what, folks? Jonathan Bernier finally gets traded. As he gets traded to the Toronto Maple Leafs, a place where he can potentially be the #1 goaltender. He also signed a 3-year contract there. So Jonathan Bernier has finally left LA, and now Jonathan Quick. We already knew he was the surefire starter, but now we definitely know it. But they did get quite a bit back with those subtractions. In that Jonathan Bernier trade, they did acquire goaltender Ben Scrivens, a good backup goaltender. He'll be the backup for Jonathan Quick. They acquire right winger Matt Fratton, solid scoring winger, and a second-round draft pick, I believe. But with Ben Scrivens, again, a very good backup goaltender. But in my opinion, from watching him play, I saw his skill level. When James Reimer went down with the injuries he did, Matt Fratton came in and filled his spot as the starting goaltender and did a superb job. So, which tells us that Ben Scrivens could quite possibly be another guy that will develop his skills in LA, and then another guy who down the road could get traded to a team that needs a starting goaltender. So this is another guy with starting goaltending potential, but it won't be in LA. In LA, he will be the backup to Jonathan Quick. So, and a very solid one too. But the main guy they get in that trade, Matt Fratton. He is the guy they really wanted from that trade, and this is a guy who at one point was sought after by many NHL teams, was a superstar in the college hockey level, also in the American Hockey League. And in the few NHL games he played with the Toronto Maple Leafs, he played very well too. So this is a guy who down the road could be a potential 20-30 goal scorer and a potential 50-60 point scorer. As of right now, though, he's going to be on the third line for the Los Angeles Kings. He's much more of a shutdown play. He'll probably play that shutdown role for now. So he's actually a left winger, I think. He a guy who could eventually work his way to that top 6 role, playing on the second line. But for now, he will be on the third line. So a guy who they're going to be watching very carefully in training camp this year and as the regular season goes on. So two great additions by the Los Angeles Kings and Ben Scrivens, and more so Matt Fratton. But they also made a couple of other additions. They made another trade, much more of a minor trade, with the Chicago Blackhawks. They acquire gritty forward Danny Carcillo from the Chicago Blackhawks in exchange for a draft pick, a guy who was starting to fade out of Chicago's system, but a guy who now with Brad Richardson gone, they lose grit, they get grit back. Actually one of the more underrated trades in my opinion. I think it's a good move because this is a guy who has experience playing with both Mike Richards and Jeff Carter. So even though he's a guy who probably should play on the fourth line, at least to start the season, we could see him playing on the second line as a top 6 forward, left wing, at least to begin the year, just because of the chemistry he has with Carter and Richards. But he's also a guy who at times could go a little crazy with the penalties. So he's a high risk but high reward player, a high reward, high risk player. So it's both a good and a bad move by the Kings. So I think it's going to be more of a good move though, because he is a good streaky. He can be a good streaky player. And then they made one, and then outside of those two trades, they made one signing of bringing in a new player. They signed big 6'6", 230-pound defenseman Jeff Schultz from the Washington Capitals, signing him to a one-year deal. And this is more of a signing that they made for if Willie Mitchell cannot play. We'll get more into that in just a sec. Another shutdown defenseman, big guy, a guy who yet another player who was starting to fade out of the system of the team he was playing for. With the Blue Liners coming in for Washington Capitals, he's really faded out for the Washington Capitals. Did not have a good season last year. He didn't play a single game in the playoffs, so it was a much expected move. He's 27 years old. Former first-round draft pick, actually. So it was a move that was coming. It was a move that everybody saw coming. So a good signing by the LA Kings, in my opinion. Now, the whole deal with Willie Mitchell, this is a guy who, ever since his final days as a member of the Vancouver Canucks, has been unable to stay healthy. He has just not been able to stay in the lineup. He's been having injuries for a long time now. He was healthy for the playoffs in 2012, won the Stanley Cup with them, but unfortunately after that, he did not play the entire season this year, hence the reason why they went out and got Robin Regehr from the Buffalo Sabres to basically replace him. Who knows if he'll be back. They're really hoping he'll be back because this is a guy who can change the dynamics of a game and really shut down the NHL's top forwards with his defensive play and his long reach. He's not as big as Jeff Schultz, but he is definitely a better player than Jeff Schultz. Because if he does play, Jeff Schultz probably will not play, and he'll be more of like a 7th, possibly 8th defenseman. So, but now the Los Angeles Kings, with all the signings and re-signings that they've made, assuming Willie Mitchell's going to be healthy enough to play, their defense is absolutely stacked right now. They got Drew Doughty, they got Robin Regehr, they got Slava Voinov, they got Matt Green, they got Willie Mitchell, they got Jake Muzzin. They got Alec Martinez as a possible 7th or 8th defenseman. They now add Jeff Schultz from the Washington Capitals as a possible 7th, 8th defenseman. And they got Keaton Ellerby, who they got in a trade midway through last season from the Florida Panthers, former first-round pick in 2007. So, yeah, despite the loss of Rob Scuderi, which is a big loss, their defense is absolutely stacked. They're in a position where they have 9 guys who can all play in a top 6 role, so expect that the LA Kings will be making some trades this season at some point down the road. But the guys who I could see not playing if Willie Mitchell is healthy is Alec Martinez and Jeff Schultz and Keaton Ellerby. So, again, expect some of these guys, possibly a top 6 guy, to get traded at some point. Now, with that being said, let us now take a look at their forwards. A very stacked lineup at forward, too. Very complete, with Anze Kopitar, definitely their best player, although he did have a bad run in the playoffs last year and a rough end to the 12-13 season. They're hoping he can get back into shape and get back to being on top of his game. They got Willie Mitchell and Dustin Brown on his wing. They got Mike Richards, Jeff Carter on the second line. As I mentioned before, Danny Carcillo, possibly the guy that's going to play with them. Their third line, Jarrett Stoll and Matt Fratton, now they add. And then the other guy who could probably play on that line is the youngster Tyler Toffoli, who could be ready to play his first full NHL season. He played 10 games last year, played very well, and then played most of the playoffs last year, played even better. So, A guy who I think personally will play this year. I think he is definitely ready to play in the NHL. And a guy who could eventually be a top 6 forward, but for now, at least to start the year, will play on the third line. And then the fourth line, Colin Fraser, with Brad Richardson gone, has officially made his name for himself as their fourth line center. He'll be centering Trevor Lewis and most likely Dwight King. You got Kyle Clifford and Jordan Nolan in there as well, both guys who could also play. So the LA Kings absolutely stacked. Every single player in that roster is roster potential for any team. If it was with any other team, that they would play. So every single player, even the backup goaltender Ben Scrivens. So it's a good situation for the LA Kings to be in for sure. Now we take a look at the top prospects for the LA Kings. They have a very good top 3 of prospects. Tyler Toffoli is their top prospect for sure, but they also got Lyndon Vay and Tanner Pearson in there. But beyond that, not maybe guys that maybe we wouldn't really know too much about, except maybe got a guy like Derek Forbort, who was their first round pick in 2010, and maybe Nick Shore, who's the brother of Drew Shore from the Florida Panthers. So this prospect pool, not as deep as the Anaheim Ducks or the Calgary Flames, but way deeper than that of the Edmonton Oilers. But the guy on that top 10 prospect list who highlights my opinions, who catches my eye the most, is probably their number 2 prospect, Lyndon Vay, former 4th round draft pick, number 96 overall in the 2009 draft, former superstar of the Medicine Hat Tigers of the Western Hockey League, former leading scorer of the Western Hockey League when he scored 46 goals and 116 points, led the Manchester Monarchs last year with 22 goals and 45 assists for a combined 67 points. So he'll definitely have another season to play with the Manchester Monarchs. Could quite possibly get called up later in the year if somebody gets hurt. But overall, he's definitely just a season away from knocking on the door and playing on the roster. I think by next year, he will be a full-time player on that roster and another guy who has top 6 potential. Speaking of that, last but certainly not least, the player on the Kings that I think needs to be good for them to get back to the form they were in the 2012 playoffs. I mean, it's hard to imagine with all the guys that they have. It was really hard to pick a guy, but eventually the guy who I picked was their second line center, Mike Richards. When they got him from the Philadelphia Flyers, they thought they were getting another top line center. So they basically had 2 top line centers in Anze Kopitar and Mike Richards. However, ever since he's arrived, he's looked more like a third line center. He's been very good defensively. Defensively, nothing has changed. But offensively, he has absolutely lost it. He definitely has not been the same offensive player he was with the Philadelphia Flyers, and that needs to change if the Kings want to win not just the Stanley Cup, not just this year, but for many years to come. Maybe go on a 4-year in a row, 5-year in a row cup run. If they have any hopes of that happening, Mike Richards needs to step up and get back to the way he was playing when he was the captain of the Philadelphia Flyers. A streaky center who kills penalties and scores a lot of shorthanded goals. A guy who changes games with his goal scoring ability. Overall, are the LA Kings a playoff team? Oh, yeah. This is a team that has way too stacked of a roster to not make the playoffs. So they definitely are a playoff team, and not only that, I think they are a top 4 team this year rather than a bottom 4 team. I think this is the year where they will finally get back in the top 4 and earn themselves home ice advantage for the first round. So, good situation in LA, and I think they are definitely ready to be a top team this year. All right, folks, that'll do it for today's episode of Hockey on the Spot. For tomorrow's episode, we will be taking a look at the Phoenix/Arizona Coyotes. So until then, you have been watching Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld, and tune in next time. Thank you, and have a great day.